Hi, I'm Miss Sarah, and this is At Home Makerspace, where every week I show you how to make fun projects with things you can find at home. This week we are continuing our Learning to Sew series. In previous videos, I taught you pre-sewing skills with projects like lacing cards and stitch cards, and I showed you how to sew with felt, both simple stitches and decorative stitches. In this video, I'll be showing you how to make a simple pillow or plush. And if you'd like to watch our previous videos, be sure to check out the links in the description. Now, on to pillow sewing. When it comes to pillows and plushes, there are all sorts of sizes and shapes that you could make. I made my small square pillow by using a small square pattern. And I made this one by cutting it out of some cardstock. Now you can choose to draw and cut out your own pattern, or you can print one from online. And I'll include some links to patterns you can print out down in the description. Now besides your pattern, you'll also need a pencil, a needle and some thread. Make sure to use a needle for hand sewing, and you can use either thread like this or embroidery floss. You'll also need a piece of fabric. I'm using some orange cotton, sharp scissors like fabric scissors, some pins, and some sort of filling. A couple of quick notes. I chose to use black embroidery floss and orange fabric because I really wanted my sewing to show up well on camera. But for your projects at home, I'd recommend using a thread that is close to the color of your fabric. For filling, I used a polyester fiberfill, which you can find at lots of craft stores. But if you don't happen to have any of this, you can fill small projects with cotton balls, or you can use dried beans to make your own bean bags. The first thing you'll need to do is cut your fabric to the shape of your pattern. But remember, when making a pillow, your final product will be smaller than your pattern. So if you want your final product to be a certain size, make sure your pattern is bigger than that. I want to cut out two identical pieces of fabric, so I'm going to start by folding my fabric in half so I have two layers. Next, we'll trace the pattern onto our fabric. Make sure to put the pattern in the corner of your fabric. If I put it here in the middle, I have a lot of wasted fabric, but here in the corner I have all this extra fabric that I could make something with. Now go ahead and use your pencil to trace around your pattern. And remember, if you're using a dark fabric, you might need to use a white pencil to make your line show up. But as you can see here, my pencil worked just fine on my orange fabric. So the next thing I'm going to do is grab my fabric scissors and cut out my pattern. Make sure to cut through both layers. When you're done, you should now have two identical pieces of fabric. Some of you may have noticed that our fabric has a dark orange side and a faded orange side. We don't want our pillow to have this faded side on the outside, so it's known as the wrong side of the fabric. We do want to have this dark orange on the outside, so this side is called the right side of our fabric. Now, if we want our pillow to have this dark orange on the outside, we're actually going to have to do something you might not expect. We're actually going to start our pillow by placing the wrong sides on the outside. Some of you are probably wondering, why do we have to do that? Well, it's because cotton fabrics will fray on the edges, meaning they'll get all of these loose strings. Since we don't want these loose strings showing up on our finished pillow, we want to actually turn our pillow inside out to hide them on the inside. But in order to have this work, we need to sew our pillow with the wrong sides facing out. Finally, if you don't want your pieces to move around as you're sewing, I would recommend putting a pin through the 2 layers of fabric to hold everything in place. So I'm going to go ahead and push the pin through like this, then turn it and push it through again so it looks like this. And I'm just going to repeat the same thing with all 4 sides. And when you're done pinning, you can hopefully see the fabric is stuck together and it's not going to move. Once your pieces have been cut and pinned together, it's time to start sewing. To sew our pillow, I'll be teaching you 2 new types of stitches. First up is the back stitch, and you'll need to have your needle threaded with a knot tied on the end. If you don't know how to do this or just need some extra help, be sure to check out my Simple Sewing with Felt video, where I offer some tips and tricks for threading needles and tying knots. I'll have it linked in the description. Now, on to the back stitch. We're going to start by removing one of the pins, and I'm going to start sewing in this corner. So I'm going to bring my needle up at the corner, and I want it to be evenly spaced from either side, something like that. Pull it through so that the knot catches, and the next stitch will be almost like a straight stitch. I'm just going over a little bit and then down and pulling my needle through and tightening the thread so I get a stitch that looks like that. Now I'm going to go up through the fabric about the same distance as my first stitch. I would guess my stitches here are about 1/4 inch. Now I'm bringing my needle up, and if I were doing a straight stitch I would go down here, but doing a back stitch I'm actually going to go back to the end of my first stitch and bring my needle down right through here. And pull it through to tighten the thread, and as you can see I now have what looks like a solid line of stitches. So once again I'm going to go up through the back side about 1/4 inch from my last stitch. Then I'm going to go back and put my needle at the end of my last stitch and pull it through. And that is how you do the back stitch. I'll just continue doing that until I get all the way across my fabric. And if you're wondering why we're using a back stitch and not a straight stitch, it's because the back stitch will hold the pieces of fabric really tightly together. As you can see, there's no gaps here between my stitches, and that makes sure that all that pillow filling won't fall out. When you get to a corner, go ahead and finish up one side, and when you're ready to turn the corner, place your needle so that the next stitch will be making that turn. So it should look something like this, and then I simply go back to the corner, and that is how you turn a corner with the back stitch. On the back side, you'll notice we now have a diagonal stitch, and that's actually exactly what you want when you're turning a corner with the back stitch. Now I'm just going to continue the same way as before until I run out of thread. When you need to switch to a new piece of thread, you're going to make a tiny stitch like this. Can you see? We just went in and out of the fabric to make a tiny stitch. Pull until we have a small loop, then bring our needle through the loop, pull it tight, and that will create a small knot, and then you can just trim off the extra thread, like that. Now grab a new piece of thread, and we're going to start our new thread by going up about 1/4 inch from our last stitch. like this. Then I'm going to go down through the end of my last stitch, and we've picked right back up with our backstitch pattern. Keep sewing the back stitch until you are almost done, but don't sew it completely closed. You do want to leave a gap of a couple of inches. And so when I have a couple of inches left, I'm going to tie off my thread. Once again, I'm going to do that by making a tiny stitch, leaving a loop of thread, then passing my needle through that loop. And I can trim off the extra. And you can see now that I've left a couple of inches unsewn. Now we are ready to flip our pillow inside out, and hopefully you can see now why it was important that we sewed our pillow with the wrong sides facing out. If your shape has corners like my square, you'll want to trim the corners to make them a little less bulky when you flip it inside out. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my scissors and cut a little square out of the corners like this. And I'm just going to repeat that with the other corners. With my corners snipped, I can now turn my pillow so the right sides will be on the outside. That is why we left that little bit unsewn. So go ahead and flip. Pay particular attention to your corners. It may take a little extra care to get them all the way flipped, but when you're done, it should look something like this. As you can see, the bright orange is now on the outside, and we are ready to fill it with our stuffing. I recommend using small pieces of stuffing rather than trying to put all the stuffing in at once. You'll be able to push small pieces into the corners much more easily than you would one large piece. Continue stuffing until you've filled your pillow as much as you'd like. Then we're going to finish by stitching up this opening. And remember, you can use other things as filling, such as dried beans, if you'd like to make a bean bag. Finally, we're going to be closing that opening with our second new stitch called the ladder stitch. As we get started, you'll want to fold in the edges of the fabric along the opening. Make sure this fold is even with the rest of your pillow. Next, place your needle inside the opening and push outward to make a small stitch. We want to start in the middle, so when we pull our thread through, the knot can be hidden between the two layers. All right, so I'm going to make sure everything is still folded in. Then I'm going to bring my needle across to the other side, like this. Then I'm pushing my needle down through the fabric and up again parallel to my seam. When I pull my thread tight, I now have a stitch that runs across that seam. And I'm just going to repeat that process. So I'm going to take my needle across to the other side, and right where it folds, I'm going to bring my needle down and then up again. And I want to have this down and up to be parallel with my seam. When I pull tight, you can now see that we have another stitch running across that opening. And I'm just going to repeat that until I've finished closing that entire seam. You'll finish your thread by making a tiny stitch, creating a loop and passing your needle through the loop, then pulling tight. I can finish by trimming off the extra thread. And now I'm just going to tuck the extra thread into the seam. And there is my finished pillow. And one final note about the ladder stitch. If you pull tight on the string, it will bring your fabric together and help to hide those stitches. So make sure to do that before tying your knot to finish. We hope you enjoyed learning how to make your own pillows and plushes. I'll be using mine as a pin cushion. If you make a pillow or plush, we'd love to see it, so please take a picture and share it with us at the library. You can do so through our Facebook at www.facebook.com/FHCPL. Through our Instagram, our handle is @FHCPL, or you can send us an email. Our email address is makerspace@finleylibrary.org. We hope you've been enjoying our Learning to Sew series, and we'll see you again soon in a brand new video. Bye!